Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle a 50-year-old nutritional myth about carbohydrates and human biology. For decades now, we've basically been operating under these massive assumptions about what our bodies actually need to just survive, let alone burn fat or perform at our physical peak. But what if the entire bedrock of our modern nutritional guidelines was built on a simple misunderstanding? Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. First up, the great carbohydrate myth. Then, how insulin really works. Third, the athlete performance paradox. Next, the timeline of a low-carb body. And finally, building a protein-centric plate.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the great carbohydrate myth, unpacking half a century of misguided advice. So, for a really long time, dietary guidelines have insisted that we need at least 130 grams of carbohydrates every single day just to fuel our brains and, well, survive. This idea has literally shaped everything from those government food pyramids we all grow up with to the snacks we pack for our kids. But Dr. Andrew Kutnick synthesized over 100 years of clinical data, and it forces us to ask a really massive paradigm-shifting question. Do we actually need them? Well, the short answer is no. Actually, since the 1960s, scientists have known that the brain can function perfectly fine on 0 grams of carbohydrates. 0. The only truly essential nutrients we need for survival are amino acids and free fatty acids. And yet, somehow, this myth just completely stuck around. Moving right along to Section 2, how insulin really works, the biological cascade. To understand exactly why this myth persisted, and honestly why it causes so much damage, we need to look closely at what actually happens inside your body the exact moment you eat carbohydrates. Whenever you eat them, even the so-called superfoods like bananas or oranges, your digestive system immediately breaks them down into individual sugar molecules that flood right into your bloodstream. Now, think of your pancreas like a highly sensitive thermostat. It instantly detects that rise in blood sugar and it pumps out insulin in direct proportion to deal with it.
Now this is where it gets crazy. Think about that staggering 6-fold increase. What's truly shocking here is that as we gain weight and become even slightly insulin resistant, our fasting insulin levels can elevate 6 times over before you even see a single change in your blood sugar on a standard medical test. Seriously, you can have perfectly normal blood sugar at the doctor's office, but underneath the surface, your body is working overtime, pumping out 6 times the normal amount of insulin just to keep things stable.
And that right there brilliantly illustrates the core of the problem. As Dr. Kutnick points out, insulin is a storage molecule. When your insulin is high, it sends a loud and clear signal to your entire body saying we're in a state of abundance. And as a direct result, high insulin completely blocks your body's ability to break down and burn stored fat for energy. Like literally, you can't burn body fat effectively if you have high insulin floating around. So let's trace the exact biological cascade of where insulin shuttles all that sugar. Step 1 is the liver. A massive 66 to 75% of insulin goes here first, storing glucose to protect the brain against starvation. Step 2 is the fat tissue, where it stops fat breakdown and stores that energy. And step 3 is the muscle. Yeah, believe it or not, the muscle is actually the body's absolute lowest priority. The only reason glucose ever ends up in the muscle is because the liver and the blood are already completely full, and the muscle is basically just acting as a final overflow reservoir. Okay, Section 3, the athlete performance paradox, redefining fuel for the human body. So this biological reality sets up a pretty fascinating contradiction. If the muscle is the lowest priority for glucose, then why on earth were high-level athletes told to consume upwards of 1,000 grams of carbohydrates a day for peak performance? Well, we can trace this massive misunderstanding all the way back to the 1960s. A physician named Jonas Bergstrom developed a technique to take muscle biopsies. He found stored glucose, which we call glycogen, inside the muscle tissue. Scientists then observed that athletes who ate more carbs had more stored glycogen, and that seemed to correlate with longer performance. But here is the catch. They falsely assumed correlation equaled causation. They basically just assumed that the stored muscle glucose was the actual cause of the endurance.
When we think about this side-by-side comparison, it completely reveals the massive blind spot in sports science at the time. Researchers focused entirely on this large glucose pool, the 300 to 500 grams stored right in the muscles. But here's the thing. Muscles are a one-way street. They take glucose in, sure, but they cannot release it back into the bloodstream to feed the rest of the body. Meanwhile, the scientific community largely ignored the tiny, critical pool. We're talking about just 5 grams of glucose circulating in the blood. That's literally about 1 single teaspoon, but that tiny pool is absolutely crucial because it's the primary fuel source protecting the brain.
When Dr. Koetnig's team finally analyzed over 160 studies spanning 100 years of data, the real truth emerged. Elite athletes restricting their carbs to less than 50 grams a day maintained their peak aerobic performance perfectly. So why did athletes in those older studies hit the wall when they didn't have carbs? It was actually because of a brain energy deficit. In a stunning 88% of those studies, the placebo group failed due to hypoglycemia, basically low blood sugar affecting the brain, not from a lack of muscle glycogen. And honestly, it gets worse. Forcing unnecessary carbs into these elite, super healthy runners was actually giving 30% of them pre-diabetes. I mean, if it's hurting the metabolisms of top-tier athletes, you really have to wonder, what is it doing to the rest of us?
Which brings us to Section 4, Timeline of a Low-Carb Body, the Reversal Phase. Look, if elite athletes don't need these massive amounts of carbs, then everyday sedentary people definitely don't either. And the really great news here is that metabolic damage, even things like fatty liver and insulin resistance, is completely reversible. To give you a real-world example of this, during a TED Talk Dr. Koetnig gave about the ketogenic diet, there was a type 2 diabetic sitting right there in the audience. They heard this exact science, applied it to their own life, and later reached out to tell Dr. Koetnig that they had not only entirely reversed their type 2 diabetes, but also lost over 100 pounds. Seriously, that is the sheer power of understanding your own biology.
So let's map out exactly what happens to your biology when you start restricting carbohydrates, because the changes actually happen almost immediately. Right after your very first low-carb meal, your insulin drops. By the 18-hour mark, ketone bodies, which are a byproduct of fat metabolism, start to elevate. Within 7 days, your body stops hoarding water. And keep in mind, every single gram of stored glucose holds on to 3 grams of water. So that bloated feeling disappears and true fat oxidation kicks in. Finally, at about 4 weeks, your blood glucose perfectly stabilizes, and if you're active, your physical performance completely normalizes to run on this new, much more efficient fuel source. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that by the 4-week mark, your body has completed what we call the metabolic flip. By persistently lowering your insulin levels, you've completely flipped the switch. You go from a sugar-dependent metabolism that just constantly wants to store fat right into a highly sustainable machine that successfully uses your stored body fat as its primary, steady source of energy. It's a total game changer.
All right, our final stop, Section 5, Building a Protein-Centric Plate, Taking Action. So, how do we actually apply all of this science in our real lives? Well, the beauty of this approach is that you really don't need to stress over exact, super complicated macro percentages to achieve this state of metabolic flexibility. Instead, you just want to construct a protein-centric plate. Start by prioritizing high-quality, nutrient-dense protein. Think about the size of your fist. A piece of salmon, some steak, or a couple of eggs. Next, add some fibrous or green leafy veggies that aren't going to spike your insulin. Spinach, cauliflower, things like that. And finally, just let the healthy fats come along for the ride. You definitely don't need to force-feed yourself extreme amounts of butter or anything crazy. Just use fat from olive oil or the meat itself to the point where you feel full and then stop. Remember, it's sustainability and consistency that actually create long-term health. Now, if you're currently struggling with your weight, or maybe dealing with prediabetes, or just chronic low energy, I know it can feel incredibly overwhelming to look all the way down the road at the finish line. But keep this highly encouraging piece of advice from Dr. Koetnig in mind. Stop stressing over changing everything all at once. Seriously, just focus on what you can control today. Just take the first step. If you choose a low carbohydrate option for your very next meal, your insulin is going to begin to drop instantly. We've debunked a 50-year-old carbohydrate myth, we've mapped out exactly how your biology works, and we've even built your plate. The science is incredibly clear, and the timeline, well, that's entirely in your hands. So I'll leave you with this one thought. What are you going to choose for your very next meal? Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and we will see you next time.